It is a common misconception that enlightenment is one supreme state above ignorance, so that either you're ignorant or by some miracle you suddenly become enlightened, or as some popular schools call it, awakened. But in actual fact, there are at least 4 stages of enlightenment, and I will introduce all 4 of them in this video. The first common 3 stages of consciousness are, of course, dreamless sleep, dream sleep, and waking. And people think they know what they are, but you don't know what they are until you become enlightened, to quite a high degree actually. Imagine you have 2 lines. Up here you have identification with the personality, the ego. Down here you have the self. In waking consciousness you are consciously aware of this level. And in dreaming and dreamless sleep you're still at this level, you're not at deeper levels. The first stage of enlightenment is called Transcendental Consciousness. And I think this is the same as what many popular teachers call awakening. And it's not really enlightenment. It's a shift in your consciousness, in your perspective on your true self, where you have become somewhat free of identification with this gross, ignorant me level up here, me. And you have had some experience of this, at least in glimpses, and you've had enough glimpses to make you begin to disidentify with this gross personality up here, which you normally or prior to awakening would consider the totality of who you were. Then you might incorporate some psychoanalytical or psychological dimensions and so on. But psychoanalysis is not, it's more subtle, but it's not moving closer towards the self. So this model doesn't incorporate that. That's transcendental consciousness. It's like taking a piece of cloth and dipping it in a vat of color and taking it up again, and some of the color remains. You wash it and some of the color remains. If you want the full color, you have to keep dipping it. But that analogy is not quite good enough, because you have to get self-realized, and that comes after transcendental consciousness. In self-realization, your conscious awareness of who you are has moved from this level up here to the level down here. This level down here is called, in the Indian terminology, Shiva and Shakti, which can be translated as pure being, Shiva, and dynamic creative potential, which is Shakti. In reality, Shiva and Shakti are one. There's no difference between them. It's not 2 sides of the same coin. It's the same side and there's only one side. In fact, there's no coin. There's just pure being and dynamic creative potential, and they are the same. But in order to comprehend it, we use 2 terms because you can experience it in 2 very distinct ways. You can experience this down here as pure being, and later you can begin to experience it as Shakti emanating. And now we're beginning to talk about the next level of enlightenment, which is God consciousness. So first you move your conscious identification, your self-understanding, self-awareness from the ignorant I to the absolute unmanifest void. Then this becomes enlivened. The Shakti begins to vibrate up through these levels, and you begin to sense that. And you sense it as bliss. It's immensely blissful. And it's full of love, and devotion to God. Now, the Neo-Advaitins will say that enlightenment begins and ends with self-realization because there can be nothing higher than the unmanifest absolute. So they will say that what I just mentioned as characteristics of God consciousness is just experience. It's experience, it's of the relative, it's unimportant, it's a distraction. Well, not so. In actual fact, they are not really non-dualists, these Neo-Advaita. Advaita means non-dual. They have realized the non-dual within. The unmanifest is of course non-dual, because since it's unmanifest, there's only one, and there's not even one, there's nothing. And these Neo-Advaitas think that once you've realized that, there's no higher realization because that would just be phenomena. Well, true non-duality means that you have realized that everything out here, just as you are in here, void and unmanifest and bliss and awareness and consciousness, everything out here is also void and unmanifest and bliss consciousness. That is non-duality. And when the progression of God consciousness is not a shift in consciousness. It's more like a phase of transition from self-realization to unity consciousness. Self-realization comes in a flash. Wow, then you're self-realized. But you may not realize you have had that flash because you have gone in and out of self-realization for so many times that you think that once you get it, it might not be the final shift and you will lose it again. But one sweet day you won't lose it again. Unity consciousness is actually a state where the difference between this and this has collapsed, and you only have a singularity, and that also comes in a flash. But God consciousness is a phase in between where you begin to sense, as it is said in various contexts, more and more subtle levels of creation. But that is typically misunderstood to mean that you suddenly become clairvoyant and begin to see angels and supreme beings, devas, devatas, devis, and so on, as they call them in India. But that's not so. If that was so, then you would just be a clairvoyant, self-realized person. And that's not what God consciousness is. In God consciousness, you begin to perceive, first, everything as a manifestation of Shakti. And this is sensed as bliss in you, recognizing bliss in the objects. And when I mean bliss, I don't just mean happiness. It's a special state of awareness, which is beyond happiness and beyond ecstasy. In God consciousness, you get that relationship with everything. And you formulate it to yourself. The mind grasps it as a divine level of creation, hence we call it God consciousness. Self-realization, you have empty void down here. It's not just void, Shiva, it's also Shakti, as I mentioned earlier. But these Neo-Advaita people, teachers, only realize the Shiva aspect, the void aspects, the unmanifest, self-absorbed void. But it's also Shakti, and there's no difference between the two. They've only just got half the story, these Neo-Advaita teachers. The other half is the dynamic creative potential, which is still Shakti, Shiva, still the unmanifest pure being. So you begin to sense Shakti in the objects you see, but you sense it on a deeper level than the superficial level of the topmost level of wood or camera case or fingernail and so on. You begin to sense that the fingernail is vibrant, dynamic, creative bliss. And you begin to sense more and more that this bliss is one with Shiva. And when you realize that these two aspects are totally one, then you enter unity consciousness. In unity consciousness, you recognize that the dynamic creative potential which everything is created out of, and the void which has never entered into creation but is a silent observer of everything, that they are one, and have never been two, have never separated, and will never ever separate. Everything is Shiva Shakti. Shiva Shakti is bliss, pure being, and consciousness. Sat, Chit, Ananda. And you experience this. And the Ananda aspect is quite different from happiness or joy. The entire body sings with love of the divine. You're way beyond shedding tears out of devotion for God because you've begun to merge with the divine. That's unity consciousness. When you begin to merge, it's God consciousness, and when you have merged, it's unity consciousness. There's a state above unity consciousness which is called Sahaja Samadhi. I wasn't sure if I would talk about that, but let's talk about that. There's a subtle duality that remains in unity consciousness, and unity consciousness is not totally stable in its clarity. It goes up and down. So that in the morning you might be more in God consciousness, and in the evening you might be in a full-blown state of unity bliss. And this can mislead people to think that they are not in unity consciousness. But they are. That is the nature of unity consciousness. It is not totally stable. There's a residue of ignorance that causes the state to fluctuate. But when you enter Sahaja Samadhi, Sahaja means natural. And when you enter Sahaja Samadhi, you're in a totally continuous state of bliss, love, unmanifest oneness with everything. There is no duality left. There is no identification with the personality left. There is only bliss, loving bliss. Or love, loving love, as love manifests as everything in your environment or in cosmos. Doesn't matter, but let's not get grandiose about it. You're in a state where you love your table, you love your books, you love your couch, you love your camera. But you don't love them as objects, you love them as independent objects. You don't love the camera because it's a camera or as a camera. You love the camera because you see that the camera is vibrant, dynamic bliss. And this bliss has structured itself into these plastic and metal pieces that make up a camera. And similarly with your nail or your nose or a bottle of water or whatever. In Sahaja Samadhi, you never leave that state and it doesn't fluctuate. That's why it's called natural, Sahaja. So in God consciousness, you develop a love relationship with the absolute, which we can call God or the divine, in everything. But you sense it as that book or door or bottle of water or whatever is an independent unit. It is a separate manifestation and it is separate from you, yet you sense in it Shakti, which is one with pure being, Shiva, and you sense it as a unique object which is blissful and thus divine. Later you realize that the Shakti, which is the bottle, and the Shakti, which is you, is the same Shakti. Hence we call that unity consciousness. Okay, I will give a short transmission. First I should say something about transmission. What I transmit is called Shaktipat, which means a transmission of Shakti. And that, of course, is also a transmission of Shiva, because Shiva and Shakti are one. Now, don't think of them as the Hindu personifications of the mythological figures called Shiva and Shakti. That's just metaphors to make it more tangible. What happens in Shaktipat is that the Shakti that I have realized I am becomes realized in you, and you as a manifestation out of that Shakti. And the Shakti in you becomes enlivened and activated and puts you on a spontaneous and automatic path of spiritual growth towards unity consciousness. First self-realization, then God-realization, and then unity consciousness. So I'll do a short transmission. Let's see, 3 minutes. The higher stages of God consciousness, you begin to perceive a golden light in everything. A shimmering golden light without any source, permeating everything. When you receive Shakti in a transmission like this, especially in person, of course, but it also works through a camera, strangely enough. You may sense a tingling sensation in your hands and your feet, and heat in the spine, and a pressure in the head or on the top of the skull. They are all indications that the Kudanlini Shakti is beginning to awaken. Now to sum up and round off, please just remember that enlightenment is not the emptiness that the Neo-Advaitians, the non-duality teachers, tell you it is. That's only the first step and the beginning of the real spiritual journey. The self is bliss, it is dynamic creative potential, and eventually it will recognize itself in and as everything in bliss.